Hello again, art history students. Welcome to another little virtual lecture. This is the second lecture in Unit 4, which is on the Renaissances. So last time um, we had a little video lecture, we talked about the Northern Renaissance. And I talked about that right after we talked about medieval and Gothic era because there's like a nice chronological kind of band that's happening, or you can kind of see the chronological jump. So just so we're clear, this moment in history that we're talking about is happening simultaneously to that Northern Renaissance. It's just happening in Italy, right? So we're kind of jumping back in time to talk about something simultaneous from a different geographic location. So again, the Renaissance is broken down, or the Italian Renaissance specifically is broken down into four ways: the early Italian, high Italian, Venetian, and then what's known as Mannerism, which is kind of the late end of the Renaissance. And again, all of these are separate from the Northern Renaissance. Okay, so here we are at the Italian Renaissance, looking at the early Italian Renaissance. So this term Renaissance means rebirth. There is this renewed interest in the classical world. I feel like I say this all the time in art history. There's always this looking back, and it usually is kind of a looking back to Greece and Rome. Something called humanism comes about at this time. And again, I said before that the Christian Reformation has a great impact on art. And in the last lecture, when we talked about the Northern Renaissance, we talked about Protestant beliefs and kind of the Protestant art that was happening. And in the Italian Renaissance, it's about Catholic beliefs, which is the major belief structure. And the church is the major patron of the arts. So we've defined that word patron and patronage in this class before, but just as a refresher, patronage is paying. Who is paying, who is funding for art to be created? In your everyday life, I know that you've watched a YouTube video or listened to something on like a podcast or something, and it'll say, if you want to support me on Patreon, right? That's this kind of idea of being funded by someone who enjoys your work. So the church is the only funder of art at this time. And there is like a small exception, and we'll talk about that exception. But that's why so much art that we're going to see in this lecture, that we saw in the last lecture, see in this one, and see in the lectures to come, is going to be very, very religious heavy, right? Because of that patronage of the church. So again, this is where the Northern Renaissance was taking place, and this is the area where what we're going to look at today is taking place. All right, so early Italian Renaissance, cannot stress this enough, that renewed interest in Greece and Rome. And we're going to see kind of a merge of that happening in some strange ways. There is also this systematic understanding of the world through math and science. In our lives today, there's like this separation of knowledges, or this separation of academic pursuits, right? When you go to college, you're either going to pursue engineering or medicine, art or science, those kinds of things. There is no distinction at this time between being an engineer and being an artist, between being someone who looks at the natural world and tries to understand it and being a doctor. Like, there is not a lot of separation between the understandings of the world. All right, so this is the quintessential early Italian Renaissance. This is the Birth of Venus by Botticelli, right? So this is again that interest in the past. So at this time, no one is worshiping or practicing those religions of ancient Greece or Rome, but they're still looking back to them. So this is the idealized female nude, right? The Venus, right, who was kind of rose out of the ocean on this giant conch shell, and that's how she was born. So this is a retelling of a pagan story, right? Because it's like part of the cultural lineage of Italy. This is another interesting example from the early Italian Renaissance. So you are more than likely familiar with this building back here. Wait, let me get a different color. Right, this is the Leaning Tower of Pisa. So the Leaning Tower of Pisa is actually part of a large kind of complex. So here we see the cathedral. This is a very common cathedral layout, which we would have learned about before, which is called the Latin cross plan. We know that this direction would be east, right? Because that's kind of always where that asp points. We're going to take a look at this building, which is the Baptistery down here, and look at some of the art from inside the Baptistery. So this is Nicola Pisano's Baptistery, which is inside of this is the pulpit. So what this is where essentially the preacher or pastor would stand up here and then lecture or deliver the sermon to all of the congregates. So let's look at a couple of these things that we're familiar with. Right, so we see that renewed interest in Greece and Rome, obviously with these use of these pillars and their Corinthian capitals, and then we have the arch, right? That's the iconic symbol of Rome, essentially. But here we have something interesting. So this is obviously part of a Christian tradition. And here we have an image of fortitude, which is on the baptistry pulpit. And fortitude is what's known as a Christian virtue. And basically what that means is a virtue is like a personality trait that you should aspire to have. So what's interesting about this is who is embodying that. So a man, right, with this lion cub here is part of Hercules's iconographical identity, right? So Hercules is this pagan character from this religion of old that's no longer being practiced, being used as a symbol for this new religions, which is not really new at the time, but you know what I mean, the new major religion of the area, right, as part to kind of communicate this Christian virtue and what it would mean to have fortitude as part of your personality. So there's an interesting kind of mix of history and the iconography of history with the current religion. There's kind of like this interesting little sandwiches that's happening. We're going to see that again. This is from the same baptistry pulpit, and this is the nativity scene. We see a lot of use of hierarchical scale here. This is Mary that's kind of reclining. And what's interesting is if she were to stand up, she could not fit within the frame that is this image, right? She's that large that she kind of comes out of the picture, or would if she were to stand up. So very clear use of hierarchical scale there. This is the bottom. So this is where we're kind of getting some symbolism in there. There's the little stairs where the pastor or preacher kind of gets up into the pulpit, right? So the pulpit part, the part that we have been looking at, is up here above. It's kind of cropped out of the picture. And the reason for that is I really want you to pay attention to these pillars down below. So a pillar is symbolic for something that holds up something else, right? So on these pillars in are lions, and then what would have been the original martyrs who were thrown to the lions, so the early Christians. In the time before Constantine, right, Christianity was that underground cult, if you remember from previous lectures. So it's incredibly symbolic and also kind of this interesting take on history that these people, which would have been basically kind of like disposable, right? We don't want them around. They don't believe in the same. It was against the law not to believe in the pagan tradition back in ancient Rome, that they got thrown to the lions. And now they are the pillar. They are literally the foundation that holds up the kind of open preaching that's happening above, right? They are the people who kind of paved the way. So this is a very interesting way of merging history with the belief structure in a super symbolic way. It's not by mistake that these guys are the central pillar, which kind of goes higher than all of these pillars that have the lions on them, right? So the lions are circling around, and then that was kind of the thing. This is what would have happened in the Colosseum at the time for entertainment. So let's keep moving on. So there is the baptistry in its entirety, right? We do not see, here we see the pillars and the martyrs at the bottom. And then I believe this one is the one with Mary. And I don't think we see Fortitude there, the one with, so we've talked about this artwork in pretty much length, looked at several images of it, so it will probably be on the test. All right, next we're still in the early Italian Renaissance. And I just want to note, as we look at these buildings, remember, this is happening after the Gothic cathedrals in the north are created, but that technology to have those giant open windows and to let all of that light in, that technology doesn't really move down south for quite a while. So we see kind of small windows, right? And then this roof, which is basically a vault, right? An arch that's been vaulted, but it's kind of smoothed over and everything is covered over with frescoes, which you are familiar with from this class previously. Just to let you guys know, these bars are added a later addition, kind of like for reinforcement of the building. All right, so this is the Last Judgment. This is that window that you would have seen from the previous slide. And this is kind of a nighttime image of it. Right? So the Last Judgment is the moment in Christianity that everyone is waiting for, right? So we see clear use of hierarchical scale here, right, with the dominant figure being the largest in the center, and then all of these people that are kind of waiting and then are waiting in line here, sorry. And then there's the choice that's being made, and some folks are being cast down into this negative area. We are going to see several Last Judgments, and we're going to kind of compare and contrast in a later video lecture, kind of the differences in time and the differences in the images that we see. This is the same building, and this is kind of a super overexposed flash photography, but I want to point out the use of all the gold leaf in these frescoes, right? So this gold leaf shines and responds to light. And if you're someone who is visiting this church, especially at the time, that reflection of light is very symbolic and very interesting to you visually. Remember, there's no TV, there's no incandescent light bulbs or electricity or any of that kind of stuff. So we kind of have to put ourselves a little bit into the idea or the context of what the people who would have originally seen this are. So now we're going to look at some of these frescoes that are on the walls here. Another thing to note is this is the door that you would exit. So this would be the image that you would see as you were leaving church, right? Or as you were leaving the chapel or whatnot. All right, so this is a model of the chapel being offered to the Virgin Mary. This is not the first time we've seen an image like this, and I love these images where there's kind of this altered scale, right? This large building is kind of being shrunk and presented. So there's this merging of real space, sacred space, this kind of exaggeration of scale and proportion, right? And this is a very symbolic image, and that's repeated over and over again. And so this would be the donor. This would be the person who essentially paid for the church to be built. All right, this is the Lamentation, right? And this is basically the kind of like taking of Christ off of the cross. So the big thing that I want you guys to take away from this fresco is all of these halos that you see. So let's look at this angel here and how the halo is positioned where it's facing us as the viewer. And then this person who is looking in profile and how their halo has almost been like turned to the side also to face us, the viewer. So no matter who the person is in the image, right? Whether they're in profile or whether they are looking directly at you, the halo is always kind of moved with the head. And that's important. We're going to talk more about that when we see some later artworks. This is from a different church. This is the baptistry doors of San Giovanni. So these are not the first baptistry doors that we've seen, and these operate just the same as the ones that we saw in the medieval period. Sorry, and they're made out of lost wax bronze cast, but they're much more, by comparison, they're much more kind of organized and like rigid and laid out in this very structural way by comparison. So that's one of the reasons why I show you guys this slide, to kind of indicate there's a difference in thought, right? There's some things that are the same, right? Using bronze because it is that traditional material of the ancient Mediterranean, right? Greece and Rome. But then there's also differences, especially in the way that things are kind of laid out and organized. This is the, I'm going to butcher this, Botticelli chapel. And it is another chapel that is filled with these beautiful frescoes. You're going to need to know this name, Masaccio, right? That is definitely going to be on the test, so you might want to jot it down. So let's look at the interior and exterior of this building. All right, so this is the exterior and the interior. That's the same window that you see on the inside and outside. So there's definitely that inability for the big giant windows. This structure, even though it's made after the Gothic cathedrals would be made, like I said, there is not that information, that style of architecture has not migrated south yet. So there's still kind of this very thick constructed buildings of the time. So let's look at some of these frescoes. This one is the expulsion of Adam and Eve. So this artwork went through kind of several stages in history. So when it was first created, the figures were nude, right? There is this interest in Greece and Rome. And in ancient Greece, the nude, idealized figure was almost always front and center, right? There was no modesty about such a thing. Even at the beginning of class, I say to you guys, like, hey, you're gonna see a lot of nudity in this class and whatnot. So then later in history, there's kind of this push towards modesty, and they actually painted over the genitals of Adam and Eve with these vines in order to hide them, to kind of make this a modest moment. Then in, I want to say like the 90s, the 1990s, so not that long ago, these frescoes were restored closer to their original imagery, closer to their original colors, and those leaves were not repainted back over. So now it's kind of like everything is kind of like come full circle, and it's now back to kind of the original intention of the artist through restoration. All right, new vocabulary word, chiaroscuro. So chiaroscuro is a term for light and dark. If you've taken any of your art classes or anything like that in high school, you probably know the term value. That's also one of the principles and elements of design, which we talked about when we learned about the principles and elements of design. It was a lot. All right, so this is basically value. It's the combination of light and dark in order to get you to see kind of form in 3-dimension. So think about it like this. A circle is a circle on a flat page, but then if it's got a light source and shadow and whatnot, it becomes a sphere. This is Masaccio's tribute money, right? So this image has something kind of new in it. Look at all these halos. Look how they respond to the position of the head of whoever they're on, like they were real, right? So the people who are in profile, their halo kind of moves in profile with them. People who are looking up or looking down, that halo tilts with that. So the halo is a symbolic thing. It's not real. It doesn't exist in real life, right? It is a way to communicate spirituality to you as the viewer. So this interest in putting the, or giving, wait, let me say it again, the interest in giving this symbolic thing, kind of like real world rules, it responds as if it were a real thing, right? That's again that interest in how much attention people are paying to the natural world and how it operates, and to how we can kind of merge that with the art world, right? That's part of this Renaissance idea of there are no separations of learning, right? This is kind of like something that you would maybe think of in physics, and here it is being depicted in art. So, all right, there is kind of a detail of all those awesome halos, right? We also see the use of chiaroscuro here, right, with kind of these shadows and whatnot. Basically, chiaroscuro makes things look more three-dimensional. All right, this is Masaccio's Trinity, right? So this artwork will 100% be on the test. And there's a couple things that's happening here that I want to break down for you guys. So we're going to go on to the next slide. Right? So here we see kind of a breakdown of who all these people are, right? Here at the bottom, we have this corpse, right? The remains of someone, right? And then you, if you were a person, right, you would be standing here, visually closest to this decay that is a person that will eventually be you, right? We're getting a little deep here. Then as we move up in architectural space, there's kind of like a little shelf, like we're moving to the next layer. And here we see the two donors. At this time, there's a belief that if you are wealthy and you commission a large artwork, if you're the patron of some kind of religious artwork, that you're like ever so slightly closer to these sacred characters, or to, it's a holier than thou kind of thing, right? So these donors are kind of up there, they're one ledge closer. And then from there, we have another kind of separation, another architectural stair step. And we see Mary and then John the Baptist here, right? And then above them, right, we see Christ. And then back behind that, up on yet another architectural level, we see sort of the Holy Spirit kind of thing. So there is this separation between you, the viewer, here, right? And then sort of this element of sacred space, or this sacred character. There's all these like separations, these kind of like stair steps that you have to visually go up, right, that separate you. And that's very, very different than what we saw in the Northern Renaissance. Remember how there was that image of Chancellor Rohan, and Jan van Eyck painted him directly sitting in the same room as Mary and the Christ child, right? They were like looking at each other, making eye contact. That's definitely not happening in this image. And that's one of those differences in the belief structure between Protestantism and Catholics, right? And I do this because I'm trying to point to them geographically, but it all gets switched up. So anyway, in the South, in Italy, is Catholicism and that Catholic tradition, which is why you see this separation of visual space equaling a separation in sacred space. Another thing I want to kind of point out is this area back here, right? So does that look familiar at all? So if it looks familiar, it's because it's from the Basilica of Maximus and Constantine, right? Which was kind of the first church. So I know we already said this, but just as a quick refresher, a basilica was a Roman constructed building that was kind of like a kind of like a meeting or gathering place for everyone, like a town hall type building. And then when Constantine took over, he kind of made this basilica into a church, right? And so this is kind of like the first open place of Christian worship, which is part of the reason why it's being depicted here. A, it's part of the religion's history, and B, it's part of Roman history, which is Italian history, which is the area of the world that we're in. It also uses perspective, this image, right? So that's how this looks so realistic, and it's thought to be the first image that uses perspective in order to depict space, right? This recession of space. So moving on. All right, next we're going to talk briefly about Florence Cathedral. So here we see kind of this overhead view of Florence Cathedral with its large, massive dome. All right, so this building remained unfinished for more than 100 years, and no one could figure out how to build the enormous dome. Now, just for reference, the Hagia Sophia has a dome, right, which is 120 feet in diameter, and then the Pantheon is 142 feet in diameter. So it's not like we haven't, as human beings, haven't made these domes before. Part of what it is that idea that when the Dark Ages happened and the world, or at least the European world and Italy and Europe, went kind of in this down place, right? There was a third of the population that was lost, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? Now that we're on this back on this upswing, it's kind of like because we had to just survive, right? A lot of those ideas were lost from the past. So how they actually came up with how to finish this dome is kind of funny. They put out a kind of like a contest, like who can figure this out? And then it was open to the general public to try to figure it out. So Brunelleschi is the one who submitted the kind of winning submission for how to finish the dome. And the interesting thing about it is the dome looks different on the outside than it does on the inside. On the inside, the dome is kind of more like a peak, like that. And then on the outside, it's more dome shaped. And that's because you can't really tell from this graphic, but there had to be all this kind of like infrastructure and all this massive amount of like stuff inside in order to hold it all up, right? It's like there's a architectural term for it and I've totally forgotten it. I'm just moving on. All right, so this made Brunelleschi the first Renaissance architect, right? It took 16 years to construct this dome. And there it is from the exterior. So you can kind of get the idea, like you saw that interior image, which was kind of looking straight up. So you could kind of tell that it was like more like a peak like this. And then this is more of an exterior dome from the outside. So that. All right, so next we're going to talk a little bit more about, excuse me, about architecture and kind of this renewal to antiquity, or kind of why Renaissance architects were so interested in this. So if you think about it, these are things, these are objects, this architecture that they would have seen all around Italy, which was from that kind of last peak, which would have been the height of the Roman Empire. They kind of see that as it withstood the test of time. Most of those buildings are still standing today. So for the people of the Renaissance, they were very impressed by that. So here we see kind of a building which is very much drawing its inspiration from the Pantheon, which was the temple to all of the Roman gods, right? So that's why we see this round building. It's like a rotunda, right? We see this Doric capitals here. So there's all this influence from Roman architecture, previous Roman architecture, but it's in a new sort of religion on the building. So they're kind of drawing from this historical kind of architecture and whatnot in a new light, for a new reason, for a new belief structure. That's kind of the theme of this lecture. All right, this is the Villa Rotonda, this is a person's house. This is not a like a temple or anything like that, but it clearly has interest in all of those same kind of classical Greek and Roman temples. The layout of the building is also important. Right? So it has this clear symmetry to the layout of the building. Basically, any way that you were to slice this building, if it were a pie, it is already symmetrical. And that's a belief for the time, was that these things that are more symmetrical are better, right? That was the goal, was symmetry, right? Symmetry, like perfect symmetry, was definitely a goal for architects and artists of the time. All right, this brings us to our first early Italian Renaissance artist, right? And this is Donatello, and this is Donatello's David. So here we see this artwork is very important for a multitude of reasons. A, it is the first full-size male nude since antiquity that is made in the lost wax bronze cast process. So remember, we talked about that process way back when we learned about Greece. Right, and I kind of informed you guys, like, this is a really complicated process, and it made sure that the fact that it was so long and arduous, and it was not a very direct process, kind of goes to show how much work went into making it, and then also kind of how much needed to be going on positively in the environment. Something that takes so long to make and construct doesn't happen when people are like they were in the Middle Ages, right? When people are dying of plague, and when there's kind of the economic collapse, and then the collapse of Rome, which ultimately led to that power vacuum. We've already kind of gone through this. So we see David here from the story of David and Goliath. If you are not familiar with this story, I'm going to give you the shortest version possible. So David is a young Israelite, and he has to go to battle with Goliath. Now, Goliath is a giant physically. He's like a humongous man, and he is part of the Carthaginian Empire. And he has a massive military behind him. They're all like in their military garb. They have helmets, they have whatever, breastplates and armor and all kinds of stuff like that. And David basically has a slingshot and faith, right? That's the kind of moral of the story. So he takes his slingshot and then ultimately brings down this giant, right? And there's a lot of symbolic things going on in the story. And what we're talking about here is the fact that this David is victorious, right? He has already conquered, right, the impossible odds that are against him. He is standing proud with his idealized male form, right? He's young, he's healthy. It's like everything is going good, right? The triumph has already happened, right? And that's symbolic of the time, right? We were in this kind of negative place with the Dark Ages, and now with the Renaissance, we're on this sort of uprise like this, right? So it makes sense that that's the moment of the story that would be depicted, this triumphant moment. All right, next we're going to talk about the Venetian Renaissance. And we have to talk a little bit about economy in order to understand the Venetian Renaissance. So this is the Mediterranean Sea, if you are not familiar. And then up here, right, is like Germany and France and all those other kinds of places. If you have goods, right, say that you're coming from Africa, which is down here, and you need to get them up to this area, the best thing to do is send your ship like this, right? Just as always in history, water transportation is the cheapest form of transportation. Always. Even today, when we have planes, trains, and automobiles and all this kind of stuff, Sending stuff by boat is always the cheapest. It's not always like the fastest, but it is the best way to get a massive cargo of goods from one location to the other. This means since Venice is the northernmost area, there is also a kind of like a Chesapeake Bay kind of thing, like a river that goes deep up into the landmass. You can take ships farthest inland as possible. This makes Venice incredibly wealthy. The fact that so much trade goes through this area brings so much economy into the area. So there is not as much religious patronage happening there. All right, first we're going to look at the Madonna and Child with saints. So we see here, right? So this is an altarpiece. It kind of is the painting that's right behind the pastor or preacher or whatnot as he stands and talks, right? So there'd be like a person there. And then again, there's that architectural division of space. Here we have a stair, and we have this would have been the patron who would have paid for it, and then the bishop of the area. And then behind them we have other kind of saintly, these are the Marys, Mary Magdalene, and then I think Saint Teresa's back there. And then there's another architectural jump up, and that's where you see Mary, and the Christ child. So again, there's that separation of architectural space, which is a separation of sacred space. This image kind of lets you see it a little bit more in its context of what kind of is overall happening. Just so you know, this like dome that's here and these architectural elements they're like faux, they're fake. They're just put there in order to help enhance the illusion of this architectural space, the illusion that this little area is a recession into sacred space, right? That's the only reason. They don't hold up the weight of the ceiling or anything like that. They're just there to enhance that visual illusion. So there's that image again. It will probably be on the child or on the test. And remember, we are talking about the Venetian Renaissance. All right, so as I said a moment ago, the Venetian Renaissance had other patrons other than the church. So we do see a lot more non-religious artwork, which if you remember from last time, that is secular. Right? Non-religious themed art is called secular art. So these are the very common depictions from the Venetian Renaissance. This sort of wonderful leisure life. Remember, money is flowing in this part of the world, right? So here we see these two beautiful women, right, outside in the warm Mediterranean air, kind of taking a bath as two fully clothed men sit with them and play music, right? And this is called the Pastoral Concert. It's this kind of depiction of just a wonderful life, right? We're going to look at more examples. This is completed by Titian, which is the Sleeping Venus. He's really Titian is the big artist that you need to know from the Venetian Renaissance. And this is the same kind of depiction, this kind of beautiful woman in this outdoor moment, nude, she's not really taking a bath, she's taking a nap, right? As there's beautiful weather and the sky kind of recedes into the background, right? It's a very leisure depiction of life, a beautiful leisure depiction. The woman is beautiful, the landscape is beautiful, the weather is beautiful, money flows in the area, it's just everything is beautiful, right? That's very much Venetian Renaissance. Here we have the Venus of Urbino. Just so we're clear, this term Venus is not necessarily a portrayal of the goddess Venus. At this time, it takes on this term that a Venus is just a beautiful woman, right? So the Venus of Urbino is an artwork that was commissioned by an incredibly wealthy man of his mistress, right? So this is not the woman who has his children. This is not his wife. This is his mistress, right? And who is this artwork for? It's for him. An artwork like this, and these other paintings also that we've seen, would probably be kept behind a curtain. So you'd have like a room in your house, like a den or something, and this artwork would hang on the wall, and then there would be a curtain over it, and it would only ever be exposed for the man at the moment that he wanted to look at it, right? This is not art for the consumption of the masses. This is art for the consumption of one. Maybe he would show it off to his wealthy friends. I'm not sure. So you really kind of understand the tie between art and economy. Stuff like images like this are not made in the rest of the Italian Renaissance. And part of the reason is no one has this kind of economy except for the church. No one has disposable income. You have to have a significant amount of disposable income to have a giant painting like this made. You have to have a place to put it. You have to have curtains to go over it, right? There's a lot that we can kind of draw about economy from images like this, secular images. All right, so now we're going to move on to the High Italian Renaissance in Italy. All right, again, there's that patronage of the church. I cannot stress that enough. This brings us to a way for you to remember all of the names. Remember, this is a name-heavy unit. So when I was young, you guys might not, the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles were enormous. I watched them. Everyone that I went to school with watched them, right? So all those names, Donatello, Leonardo, Michelangelo, and Raphael, are all named for the masters of the Italian Renaissance. We already talked about Donatello. Right? This is Donatello's David from the early Italian Renaissance. It also happens to coincide that Donatello is like the oldest of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, just for your information. All right. Next is Leonardo da Vinci. We have here. So this image, which you've probably seen before, which is called the Vitruvian Man, is Leonardo da Vinci was solving essentially a riddle of the time. So Vitruvius is a man who put forward this, I guess you could call it a riddle. He said that the idealized human form could not exist in both a circle and a square simultaneously, right? That the proportions of the body could not do this. And this is how Da Vinci proved him wrong. So that's the Vitruvian Man. If you've seen this image before, most folks have seen this. It's pretty popular, it comes a lot memes and that sort of thing. So Da Vinci is the ultimate artist that fits into that Renaissance man category, where there is no distinction between being an engineer and being an artist, or being anything and being an artist. Right? So Leonardo da Vinci made a lot of machines as far as drew out their construction. He technically invented the first helicopter. He also invented the first like tank with like, you know how in today's military tanks there's like a turret thing that can rotate 360 degrees. He invented that. Technically in drawing form. A lot of these things were never constructed. He did make the first robot, physically constructed it. It was a lion that he made for a princess, and it could basically walk and move its mouth on its own. It was like a very elaborate wind-up toy is basically what it was. So let's talk a little bit about Da Vinci's exploration into all of these things. So during this time in the Catholic Church specifically, there was not a lot of medical knowledge being developed. It was thought to be blasphemous. It was against the law. It was against the religious doctrine to like touch dead bodies except for burial purposes. the idea to do something like an autopsy to understand why someone had passed away was absolutely out of the question. But Leonardo da Vinci wanted to know about the human body, A, so that he could draw it better, and B, because he was just a curious individual. He wanted to know more about everything that he could, engineering, science, math, etc., etc. So he actually risked his own life by like purchasing black market bodies and then bringing them home and doing autopsies and trying to understand how things work inside of the human body. So you have to have a massive amount of curiosity to risk your life in order to figure out how these kinds of things work, which is why we call the term Renaissance man basically comes from Leonardo da Vinci being so curious about so many things. This is Da Vinci's Mona Lisa. This is the most recognized artwork in the entire world. You should probably have seen it before we would have gotten to this lecture. And if you can identify it on the test, it's probably kind of a give me as to who was the artist or what the title is. I don't want to see anybody get that question wrong. All right, this is Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper. This is a fresco, and it would be on the wall of basically like the cafeteria of a place where monks and nuns would live. So if you're looking at it and you're thinking, well, this painting doesn't look like it's in very good shape, right? It looks like it needs to be restored, right? We talked about the restoration of those frescoes a couple minutes ago. The sad thing is that this painting can't. Da Vinci was an experimenter. He was always trying new things, and he actually mixed tempera paint and oil paint into the plaster to make this fresco. That has created a chemical reaction that over time, this painting is actually eating itself. It will never be able to be restored and will eventually just kind of disappear through the ravages of time, which is sad. But let's look at some other images of it and kind of break it down a little bit more. So this image uses perspective, right? The vanishing point is kind of a symbolic vanishing point. So all of the lines of the roof over their head goes back. Here we have kind of an image of the where the painting is in context to the room. I think that's important for you to know. So this would be as you ate as a nun or monk, right? You would eat, and this would be what you would see on the wall. And there is an image of it potentially in kind of the vibrant colors that would have originally been painted in. All right, so all of the attention is being drawn to this one vanishing point, which is also very symbolic. Another thing I want to point out is that use of the table. Right? During the Northern Renaissance, we saw an image of a Last Supper and we kind of talked about the table a little bit. And there is a table here, but it's just kind of a place where everything's setting. It's not the same, it doesn't have the same weight visually as the table did in Albert Durer's Last Supper from the last lecture. All right, so there's that again. All right, next we're going to talk about Michelangelo. Michelangelo was one of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and he is also was the one of the first artists to be mentioned in the first art history book who was alive during that time. Right? So when Michelangelo was alive, he was the biggest artist that had ever been, right? And not that Leonardo da Vinci did not have a positive career or anything like that, but Michelangelo was the most popular artist there could be. So he also has a little bit of a personality reputation. He was he studied under Leonardo da Vinci. They were, there's quite a bit of age difference, but they technically were alive during the same period of time. So when he became super famous, he then had people apprentice underneath him and learn under him. So when we look at this image, it kind of looks like there's two drawings. It kind of looks like one drawing is over top of another. And that's what has happened here. So one of Michelangelo's students or apprentices or people who worked under him had this drawing. This is how the story goes. Had this drawing that they were very proud of. And they brought it to him like, look what I've done. How isn't it, didn't I do a good job kind of thing. And he, being who he is and who he was, took the paper from him and was like, nope, that is not good enough. Let me show you how to make a real drawing. And then drew this drawing over top of the other drawing, kind of just to be me, right? So we're gonna talk a little bit more about that personality as we move forward. This is Michelangelo's David, right? So this is not the first depiction of David that we saw, but this one is from the High Italian Renaissance, right? This moment of intellectual prosperity, right? So much is being learned and understood about engineering, and we're figuring the world out. And that's the moment of the story that's being depicted, right? We don't see, right, David in a victorious moment. We see him in the moment where he's trying to figure out what to do. How do I defeat Goliath? He has his slingshot here, but you almost can't tell that it's there, right? It's almost like so small, right? That weapon is so minuscule by comparison to what's going on intellectually in David's head. That's what the depiction is happening. So the other things that are interesting about this is there's that idealized male nude, of course, and then has the contrapposto stance. When this was created, it was supposed to be up on top of a building. So the viewer would actually be looking up at it from this dramatic angle. So Michelangelo made the feet a little bit small and then the upper body a little bit larger, right? So the head and the hands are just a little bit big for the size of the feet and legs. And the idea was that as you, the viewer, looked up at it, you would see it in perfect proportion, right? So he's thinking that much about how you view this object. The other thing is when he went to the quarry, which is where marble is taken out of the ground, this piece of marble was sitting off to the side. And he was told by, I guess, the quarry master, the guy who ran the quarry, you can't use that piece of stone. It has a fault crack in it. If you try to make a sculpture out of it, it will not stand. It will break. It will crack. And Michelangelo, being who he was, being the greatest artist of the time, was like, I can do anything. Took that piece of marble and made this magnificent statue out of it. All right, so we're definitely building kind of a personality trait or a personality for Michelangelo. This is the Sistine Chapel. You may or may not be familiar with it. It is the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. So when Michelangelo painted this, he had to figure out how to paint it because he couldn't look up at the ceiling constantly like this. So he actually created this whole elaborate system of harnesses, and so that he could lay down and paint up. This was commissioned by the Pope. He started painting it, and then the Pope came in and said to him, Michelangelo, it is so beautiful. There's no way you could ever make anything more beautiful than this. And Michelangelo, being who he was, painted over the whole thing and started over again, right? Just for that challenge, just to say, oh, you don't think I can do better? I can do better. Another thing I want to point out to you guys about this is these kind of triangular shapes are real architectural elements that are going over top of the windows, right? You can kind of see the edge of the windows here. All of this architectural stuff that you see here is all painted architecture. It's not really there. It's used as an element to visually separate out parts of Bible stories, basically. The creation of Adam is the most famous. Let's look at that. right? You've probably seen this before. So these things, although they look like real architectural elements that have figures standing on them and whatnot, it's not. It's all a smooth surface, which is very, very well done because all of these figures seem to respond to light. They all cast shadows actually on the architectural elements, right? You can kind of see here where this line, these two lines are, where it almost looks like this person is visually there, right? This shadow appears. So we kind of see some of those same kind of things that the Ghent altarpiece was putting out, this response to real light, which creates this ultimate illusion. All right, this is another detail from the Sistine Chapel, right? So this is real architectural element, but this is not this thing that this lady is sitting on. So she is the Libyan Sibyl. And what a Sibyl is this is from the ancient Roman belief structure. And a Sibyl's kind of like an oracle. It's like a, a prophet. Of someone who foretells things to come. So it's also, again, very interesting that there is this relationship, this visual depiction of something from this pagan past put onto this Christian building. Another thing that I want to point out is look at this lady a little bit. She looks very, very masculine. So this is, again, that image, but in its original drawing. So this is kind of the study for the Libyan Sibyl. We can see how much detail Mr. Michelangelo is paying, just even to the way the fingers and the hands, how everything is being held, significant amount of detail. And again, that very masculine body, right? He did not use female figures to depict these. It was all males. So here we have Michelangelo's Last Judgment. This is also in the Sistine Chapel. This is not the first Last Judgment that we've seen in this lecture or in this class, right? So we see not as much use of hierarchical scale. There's still a little bit there. Mary and Jesus kind of have a larger form, but most of the forms seem to be relative in proportion to each other. So this image was actually so scary that after it was depicted, and for very long in history, there was a big curtain that would go over this because people were just so terrified of it. So let's take a look at something very telling in this image right here. So this is the detail from the Last Judgment. And what is happening here is a self-portrait. At this time in history, there was this belief that your sins in this world would translate to a very specific end for you in the next world, which would be hell in this context, right? So Michelangelo was gay, and the belief was that if you were gay, that you would then meet this consequence of having your skin filleted off of you in the afterlife. That was your punishment, right? The punishment was derived from this concept of the body and not using the body properly or something like that. So let's break that down. The time that Michelangelo was alive, he was considered a sinful person. Other people who were of the what we would call today the LGBT community would have been persecuted, would have been killed for this crime, for this lifestyle. But Michelangelo was such a good artist that the church knew that he was gay, but still allowed him to be alive and allowed him to work and operate because he was so good at what he did. Can you imagine that pressure in your life, right? We should all be thankful that we live in the moment in history that we do, where there is not this kind of persecution of people, and that people can be celebrated for their achievements, and their achievements cannot be what just keeps them alive, right? Because that's basically what the kind of life that Michelangelo would have lived. There would be this constant fear and potentially this potentially seeing people that he knew who lived the same life as him would be persecuted. So there would be an incredible pressure on life. And I think that's part of the reason why we saw so many of the examples of his personality kind of being this confrontational personality. And it probably stemmed from this quite a bit. So we definitely can be thankful for the time frame that we exist in today. All right, so we got a little heavy there. So I always kind of end talking about Michelangelo on this artwork. So this is the tomb of Julius II. And this is a depiction of Moses. This is carved from marble again. So one of the big things that I want to point out is on the head of Moses. So there are these horns that are depicted. So there was a mistranslation in the translation of the Bible from the Middle Ages that lasted long through the Renaissance, where when Moses comes down from the mountain after talking to the burning bush, the mistranslation is that he actually glows, which is the actual translation, but in the mistranslation it says that he radiates horns, kind of like spiral horns, like a goat would have. So that's what we see here. That's what we see, that depiction of Moses with those horns. If you find this kind of amusing, which I do find it kind of amusing, it's worth a Google. It's worth like a Wikipedia Google to see all of the images through history where Moses has these horns because of this mistranslation. So that is kind of ending Michelangelo on a little bit of a funny note, but you can still definitely see this is an incredible marble carving of Moses with the utmost amount of detail. All right, last but not least of our Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, the greatest artist of the Renaissance is Raphael. So here we have a depiction of the Virgin and Child, which is just a light sketch, which is in silver point, which is basically a silver pencil that would be used at the time. So here we have Madonna of the Meadow. This is one of Raphael's most famous artworks. So as you look at this, you can see Mary and then the Christ child and then John the Baptist, who was, I guess, the cousin, kind of in this triangular shape. So let's look at that shape a little bit more. If you remember back to when we learned about Greece and Rome, we talked about that golden ratio, and it was always used in a rectangle. So here, Raphael has used that same mathematical equation, but created a triangle out of it. And that triangle is symbolic because it has to do with the Holy Trinity, right? So he's using this shape, right? He's using this ratio from the past in this kind of new context. So I cannot stress enough that importance of the antiquity with the new religion, right? They're really coming together in a multitude of ways. And this will be the last artwork that we see for this lecture by Raphael. So this is the School of Athens. This is technically a secular artwork. It has to do with Greece and Rome and sort of the origins of Western education and philosophy. So we see these kind of arches here, right? Do they look relatively familiar? All right. Basilica of Maximus and Constantine, again, trying to draw on that past imagery to kind of put forward a point about contemporary time for this time. All right. So all of these people that you see would be our various philosophers, but there are these two here in the center, right? Which all are kind of they're like where the vanishing point comes together. They're obviously the focal point for the image. Just to be clear, this is real architecture, right? That's outside here. And this again is one of those kind of like vignettes where you're looking into a wall as if it's an opening into a new place. So who are those two guys in the center? They are Plato and Aristotle. is actually who they are depicting, which are kind of like the two big fathers of philosophy. But Raphael was also taking a page from art history, and he wanted to pay homage to the two people who inspired him the most, Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo. So the older man, who is Plato, right, in the image, is supposed to be a depiction of Michelangelo, and then the younger man is, or Leonardo da Vinci, and then the younger man is Michelangelo. Sorry. Remember how earlier I said that they were contemporaries? They're not the same age, but they did exist at the same time, right? Raphael is the youngest of these major artists of the Renaissance, and thus he is paying homage to those. So if you see on the test, who are those two guys in the center? There are 4 potential answers: Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, Plato, or Aristotle. So that will be a test question. Here are your key terms. If you have any questions, do not hesitate to email me. I am happy to answer them. Thanks again.